of Manor Castle.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 481, and I will also speak very briefly to the other amendment in this group, 483. It hasn't, of course, been introduced yet, so we'll regard this as perhaps a amuse-bouche, a taster of what's to come, given we're talking about growing food as well as other things. And I was actually last week at the event with the Sheffield Festival of Debate, where talking about just access to land, and people were saying what you should be doing in the House of Lords is speaking up for the right to grow food. And so I'm looking forward to the Noble Lady Baroness and Boycott and others speaking on that amendment, but I think that is really setting out an important principle. But what I really want to speak to is Amendment 481, and this is to bring in my second attempt to bring in what's generally known as Zane's Law, and that's named after Zane Bangbola, for whom was founded the Truth About Zane campaign, which is still working with a wide range of support to get on the record the truth about the 7-year-old's death in Chertsey in 2014, when floods swept hideously toxic hydrogen cyanide into the family home. That's not what the inquest verdict concluded in 2016, but the inequality of the arms in the legal representation in that inquest and the illogic of the verdict, given the fact that Zane's father's Kai at the same time was left paralysed by hydrogen cyanide, means that it's surely going to have to go back. And it very much highlights a broader issue, and that's why I, the family and many others are campaigning for Zane's Law. Now, to go back a bit in history and set out the legal background to this issue goes back to 1974, when the Control of Pollution Act first took control over waste disposal. But when that came into effect, many historic dumps were quietly closed and essentially have been forgotten about, except perhaps by people in the local community. Now, EU regulations on waste and pollution came in through the Environment Protection Act in 1990, tightening up controls, and particularly there was Section 143, which provided an obligation for local authorities to investigate their area and draw up public registers of land that may be contaminated. Section 31 of that Act also gave local authorities powers to inspect closed landfills and clean them up if necessary. But the fact is that lots of housing developments are and continue to be on old landfill sites. And what happened was there were 3 consultations between 1991 and 1993, which eventually decided that Section 143 of that Environmental Protection Act 1990 would not be enacted, and all plans for public registers of contaminated sites were going to be dropped. The explanation given was the cost and the desire to, quote, not place new regulatory burdens on the private sector. Now, limited powers were brought back in 1995, although they didn't come into force until 5 years later, which meant that when developers found contamination problems, public authorities had to pay. But the situation even further worsened in 2021 as part of the Cameron government's bonfire of red tape to reduce statutory burdens. The right that the enforcement authorities had to use the law was further reduced. The emphasis was on voluntary clean-up by developers with no real power to check that it had been done. So this Amendment 481 essentially attempts to return to the situation we would have been in if Section 143 had actually been enacted. So one noble lord in discussion before this asked me about the big question, the problem of who's going to pay for this. And I would point to that being in your Lordship's House where we're not allowed to allocate spending, I haven't directly in this amendment addressed that issue. However, 2C of this says that would make it the law to identify the resources required to bring all land contamination in England to safe levels. So I would say in answer to that question that I'm going as far as I can, essentially is that point. Now, the last time that I brought Zane's Law before your Lordship's House, indeed in this very room, was in the Building Safety Bill. And one of the questions, in that debate then, the Labor front bench expressed some interest and some support for this amendment, a different front bench. And I did believe the Lib Dem front bench also did at the time. But the question was asked from the Labor front bench, is this really an issue? Is this really a problem? Now, of course, we have the tragic death of Zane to point to. And of course, we're in a situation with the climate emergency where we're seeing increasing levels of flooding, increasing temperatures. We're also seeing erosion around the sea, where there's often been landfill sites at sea level. These are increasing problems. But just to give the committee some practical examples of this, just 3 cases which have been highlighted in the media just in recent weeks. Near Dudley, it's planned to build 72 homes on a former landfill site that was once home to hundreds of tonnes of toxic waste. This is near Cedar Avenue in Coseley in Dudley. It was an old open-cut coal mine. It became actually a fishing site. Then in the 1970s, it became a landfill site. Some of the things that locals recall being dumped there were fruit machines and vegetable waste and medical waste, and up to 220 tonnes of toxic metal compounds, including industrial waste products such as mercury, arsenic, cyanide and asbestos, all of which I don't think I need to tell this committee have serious concerns. There are plans to put 72 affordable homes on that site, currently on hold because of local controversy, so far as I'm able to establish. There's also the village of Somercotes in Derbyshire, where there's plans to develop hundreds of homes on a patch of land that's been dubbed the most contaminated site in England. It's supposed to include particularly highly toxic dioxin, which has been illegally dumped there in the past. And just my third case study is Copenhagen Place development in Crewham in Cheshire, where 263 homes, some of them are already being built, and it's feared that those homes are on a contaminated site. So we have a very clear issue here, and we have an approaching issue with the government planning to talking about building hundreds of thousands of new homes and the rightful desire to put those on brownfield sites. The first thing we have to do is know what's on those brownfield sites and whether they are indeed suitable for housing in view of potential contamination problems. So that's what this amendment does. In a way, it's not being particularly new or creative. It's simply bringing in something that was thought to be, decades ago, was thought to be necessary and is only very clearly more necessary now. So this is something I'm going to keep pushing. I'd love to think that the noble lady, the Minister, will leap up and say, yes, you're absolutely right. But I would ask at least that the government would really go away and look at this issue, because there is a problem here. It's clearly affecting many people's lives, and it presents an enormous risk to many people's lives. And surely a basic duty of government is to ensure the security of people in their own homes, which, quite frankly, it is unable to do now because it is not empowering local authorities, directing local authorities and resourcing local authorities to actually ensure they know what's there in their land. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed.